Desperate to cure her illness, Lexi decides to take an experimental treatment, though the side effects may involve becoming less human. Gary visits a local bar when an alluring woman named Shauna sits beside him. Mesmerized by her beauty, he offers to buy her a drink, to which she gladly accepts. As the bartender prepares their order, the two get acquainted. Shauna shares that she ended up in the bar because her car broke down. Her friend will come to pick her up, but she has to wait until she gets off work. She asks Gary if he knows how to fix her car, but he says he's not a mechanic and he's only in town for a meeting. He offers her a ride home so she doesn't have to wait for her friend. Shauna thinks twice about the offer, but when he hands her his business card, she finally trusts him. She excuses herself to make a quick call to her friend. However, when she gets to a corner, she only pretends to talk on the phone before she rides off with Gary. Not long after, the two arrive at Shauna's place. They decide to dip in the pool where she wades into the water. Shauna seductively looks at him and submerges her head in the water. Gary prepares himself for the thrill, but his eyes widen in fear when he feels a sharp pain in his crotch. Suddenly, Shauna emerges from the water, revealing her razor-sharp teeth. She pulls Gary underwater, and the pool becomes red with blood. Elsewhere, Richard prepares his breakfast when his ailing girlfriend, Lexi, wakes up to greet him. Lexi shares that she feels weaker every day, and her treatments aren't improving her health. Richard suggests getting a new doctor and reassures her that she'll beat her illness as other people have. However, Lexi has lost hope. Just then, she remembers a girl named Allison, who was pulling her records from the clinic the other day. She told Lexi that she was going to a new doctor who used a new treatment. Allison claimed that it's improving her health, and Lexi believes this because she physically looked better. Hearing this, Richard suggests meeting the doctor, but Lexi says it's not an approved course of therapy. She's skeptical because it's an experimental procedure. When Richard hears this, he expresses his disapproval, saying that she'll be like a laboratory animal. Lexi knew he'd react this way, so she pleads for him to agree. Richard finally agrees to let her go to the doctor today, but she has to tell him everything when he gets home from work. After this, he picks up his briefcase and bids Lexi goodbye. Elsewhere, Gary's tattered body is found on the beach. Detective Rogers is grossed out by the scene, and Detective Shane reckons that he may have been eaten by a shark or was shredded by a boat propeller. However, they can't be sure, so they wait for the autopsy results. Meanwhile, Richard arrives in the office and gets greeted by Mr. Wheelwright. Wheelwright sarcastically mentions his tardiness, then critiques his reports. Despite Richard's best efforts, Wheelwright thinks they're boring, and he should take inspiration from his workmate, Jeff. Richard argues that Jeff copies his reports from the internet, but Wheelwright disregards this. He mentions that Jeff also got a promotion, much to Richard's frustration. Just then, Jeff enters the room and invites Richard for drinks after work. He's bitter about not getting the promotion, so he refuses and says that he needs to tend to Lexi. Jeff assumes that her health is deteriorating, but he still motivates his friend to hope for better days. As Jeff leaves, he jokingly says he needs to fire some people. Elsewhere, Lexi meets Dr. Sinclair, who tells her that she's the perfect candidate for his new treatment. He then talks about Allison and how she was in the same shape as Lexi, but a month after her treatment, she's nearly close to being cured. Sinclair asks if she's ready to take the next step, and when Lexi asks what it is, he takes her to a separate room with a tank filled with piranhas. He explains that the room is warm because the creatures need a temperature that mimics a tropical environment. Sinclair explains that researchers have been studying the shark's ability to repair its own DNA. After finding commonalities between their genes and humans, researchers aim to create medicines that can interrupt the formation of cancer cells in humans. They weren't successful, but Sinclair claims that he found a way to accelerate the process. He explains that he only needs to inject her with a tiny strand of Piranha's DNA. Sinclair urges her to do the procedure now, but Lexi hesitates. Because of this, he tells her that a new life is ahead of her and she only needs to reach out. This convinces Lexi, so she agrees. At the police station, Shane receives a report about two other men with the same cause of death as Gary. Just then, Rogers hands him Gary's autopsy results, and it says that his lungs are filled with chlorinated water. They also recovered a bunch of sharp, tiny teeth in his body. Meanwhile, Richard calls Lexi to check in. She picks up, but she's barely in good condition because of the treatment's horrible side effects. However, she hides this from Richard and tells him to have dinner alone and not disturb her when he goes home. Richard finds this odd, but he agrees and makes plans to spend the evening with Jeff instead. After dinner, Richard and Jeff head to the local bar for drinks. Suddenly, an attractive woman approaches them and introduces herself as Allison. Richard recognizes the name from Lexi's story but assumes that she's a different Allison. She asks the men if she could borrow their hot sauce, but she does this in a suggestive manner. Jeff sees this as a ghost signal, so he ditches Richard to sit with Allison. Before she leaves with Jeff, Allison is with Shauna, who's now set on seducing Richard. However, he refuses and pays before leaving. Meanwhile, Allison takes Jeff to the same place where Shauna took Gary. He instantly notices how warm it is, so Allison explains that she's a clothing-optional kind of girl. This excites Jeff, but she tells him to wait for her while she freshens up. Just then, he decides to call Richard to apologize for leaving him. Richard says he understands and he's on his way home. Suddenly, Allison calls, so Jeff bids his friend goodbye. Jeff giddily runs to her and gets excited when he sees her wrapped in a towel. She then slowly unbuttons his shirt and pushes him to the bed before removing her towel. The two make out, but Allison suddenly stops. Just then, Jeff panics when he sees her sharp set of teeth. When he gazes at her chest, he shivers in fright upon seeing sharp teeth on her bosoms. Allison attacks him, gnawing on his neck while her chest munches on him too. He struggles to escape, but he doesn't last long and dies. The following morning, Richard wakes up from the sofa when he hears noises coming from the kitchen. Lexi is making breakfast for him and she looks lively and healthy. Richard immediately approaches her and comments on her looks. Lexi smiles and says it must be the treatment from yesterday. This surprises Richard since she didn't tell him that she started it already. Seeing the disappointment in his face, Lexi asks why he's upset that she's feeling better. Richard says it's not the case, but he wishes that they got to talk about it first. With this, he asks for more information about the treatment, but Lexi claims it's confidential. This baffles Richard, but then he notices that the house is too warm. When he attempts to adjust the thermostat, Lexi stops him, saying that she feels cold. When Richard arrives at the office, he receives a call from Wheelwright, asking if he knows where Jeff is. He responds that he hasn't seen him since last night and doesn't know where he is now. Hearing this, Wheelwright suddenly rants about Jeff's plagiarized reports. He tells Richard that if he sees Jeff, he should notify him that his promotion will be handed over to him. This makes Richard smile. After the call, Richard receives another one, telling him to come to the police station. Richard is confused, but he obliges. When he arrives at the station, Shane bluntly tells him that Jeff is dead and his coveted promotion is a prime motive, so he's a suspect. However, Richard denies the allegations and explains that Jeff took off with a girl named Allison. They don't believe him, so he demands a lawyer. However, Shane says he doesn't need one yet and he's free to go. Richard goes back to the office to pack his things and head home. Wheelwright walks over to him, pissed that he suddenly left the office. He threatens to give the promotion back to Jeff, but Richard tells him that he's dead and the police think he's the killer. Richard explains that he needs to go home and inform Lexi about the matter. Knowing that he's a suspect, Wheelwright cautiously lets Richard go, afraid that he might be killed next. When Richard gets home, Lexi is nowhere to be seen. However, she left a note saying that she's breaking up with him. She's moving into a group home with people who are having the same treatment as her, and she doesn't want him to look for her. The series of odd events annoy Richard, and when he finds Sinclair's business card on the table, he decides to visit him. Meanwhile, Shauna is devouring another victim. Elsewhere, Richard talks to Sinclair, but when he asks to speak with Lexi, he gets turned down. Sinclair explains that he can't release any private information about his patients. Hearing this, Richard says that everything is progressing too fast and he's worried about Lexi. Just then, Sinclair gets summoned over the speakers, so he excuses himself. With him gone, Richard decides to snoop around to find Lexi. He passes by the room with the piranha tank and wonders why Sinclair keeps those there. Sinclair walks into the room and tells Richard to leave. Before he does, he asks what would happen if the piranhas escaped, and Sinclair replies that he simply has to put ethylene glycol in the water to kill the fishes. He also asks why the room is so warm, and Sinclair explains that they're tropical creatures, so it's essential for their survival. Richard can tell that something's up, and before he leaves, he threatens Sinclair that this is not their last encounter. After he leaves, Allison walks into the room, and Sinclair tells her to keep a close eye on Richard. Later on, Richard goes to the local bar. Sam, the bartender, easily guesses his order, claiming that he's good with faces. Because of this, Richard shows him a photo of Jeff and asks if he remembers him. Sam says he's not actually good with faces and he can't remember Jeff at all. Suddenly, Shauna sits next to Richard, and he immediately remembers her as Allison's friend. Shauna is being flirty with him, but his mind is fixed on Jeff. He plainly tells her about Jeff's death, and Shauna claims it's horrible but might be why he didn't call Allison back. As Richard excuses himself to the bathroom, Shauna looks for something in her bag. Meanwhile, Richard calls Shane and tells him to head for the local bar because he's gotten hold of a lead. He says he'll keep her there while he waits for them. When he returns to Shauna, he proposes a toast to the most beautiful woman in the room. She gets flattered and they gulp down their drinks. However, Richard suddenly gets drowsy and loses consciousness. Later on, he wakes up in a beach house. When he goes outside, he sees Allison sunbathing by the docks. He immediately approaches her and asks what happened to Jeff. She says that Jeff was met by foul play and he would have had the same fate if it weren't for Lexi. Just then, Richard realizes that Allison was the one who introduced Lexi to Sinclair. This provokes Allison, and she says that he should be grateful because she saved Lexi's life. When Richard asks where Lexi is, Allison responds that she doesn't want to see him and advises him to leave town if he wants to live. Richard doesn't say anything and quietly leaves. He immediately reports everything to Shane. He says that Allison and Shauna threaten to kill him if he doesn't leave town, and they're keeping Lexi somewhere. He figures that these girls were injected with fish DNA as part of a medical experiment and must stay warm like the fishes. He even calls them PiranhaWomen. Richard gives them Lexi's phone number and tells them to track it. Shane reassures him that they will, though he jokingly looks at Rogers and says they'll find the PiranhaWomen. Elsewhere, Allison and Shauna go swimming in a pool and easily glide in the water like fishes. However, Lexi doesn't join them since she seems bothered by something. At the station, Shane and Rogers inform Richard that Lexi's in a group home for recovering patients. Shane says they can't just bust in without a warrant. This is the final straw for Richard, so he leaves, knowing that the detectives will never believe him. Just as he leaves, Shane tells Rogers that they'll wait for an hour, then they'll track Richard's phone to see what he's up to. Later on, Richard goes home to get his gun. Just then, Shauna appears, clad in a bikini. She calls him dumb for not leaving town, and now he'll suffer the consequences. Shauna punches him, and he gets dizzy and falls to the couch. She prepares to devour Richard, but he wakes up and shoots her. Richard curses over how disgusting the scene was, then heads to the group home. There, he remembers Sinclair saying that ethylene glycol can kill the piranhas, so he brings some with him and pours it into the group's home pool. After this, he adjusts the room temperature to make it freezing cold. Suddenly, Allison appears and attacks Richard. He struggles to get her off him, but when he gains the upper hand, he pushes Allison into the pool. She squirms in pain, struggling to get out of the water. The pool flickers as if lightning is coming out of Allison's body. Finally, Richard brings out his gun and shoots her. Suddenly, Shane busts into the vicinity and sees the sparks from the pool. Allison emerges from the water and she has turned into a horrifying piranha humanoid. This shocks Shane, but Richard barely explains the situation because he's set on finding Lexi. Not long after he leaves, Allison sinks to the bottom of the pool and dies. Meanwhile, Richard finally gets reunited with Lexi. They hug and immediately leave the place. However, the sky begins to rumble once they go outside, and Lexi hesitates to go with him. Just then, it rains, and when the water burns Lexi's skin, she suddenly turns into a piranha humanoid, and Richard can only scream in horror. When Shane arrives at the scene, Lexi has fully dissolved. Richard hysterically cries before her clothes, which are the only remaining bits of her existence. Shane then takes his arm and tells them that they need to leave. Elsewhere, Sinclair welcomes a new patient into his clinic. Before doing the procedure, he tells the girl that she will get amazing results, one where she won't even recognize herself.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.